Well, welcome back to our deep dive into PMBOK, the 5th edition. We have two modules left in the series, 25 and 26, and they both talk about project procurement management. We've left this as the last knowledge area because it is more or less a peripheral knowledge area as opposed to the main knowledge areas of actually creating and producing the project. These are your procurements that you may need from a third party for goods or services to fulfill certain needs and activities in your project schedule. So as we'll see, we purchase and acquire things that are outside of our project team, meaning it could be a third party outside of our organization or outside our team in our own organization. And we would handle those kind of agreements for goods and services within our own organization, usually with a vehicle called a MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding, and we'll see that as we come up. So today, right here in Module 25, we're going to talk about, like all knowledge areas, a procurement management plan, how we're going to handle our procurements, and then we're actually going to look at 12.2 where we actually go out, solicit bids, analyze them, select a successful supplier, and then place the purchase order or agreement, whatever it might be, and we'll see there's different types. So let's define this so we get a good frame in our mind what this is. Project procurement management is all about processes, like everything else in PMBOK, necessary to purchase or otherwise acquire the products, services, or some kind of a result, okay, needed to or from the outside of the project team. And of course, whatever you do acquire or purchase has to have benefit and value and relate to some activity that contributes to a deliverable for the overall project. So this is the framework that we're working with here. There are 4 processes in the procurement process group, as we saw on the overview diagram. Plan your management, conduct the procurements, then control those procurements over their life, and finally close them out. And regarding closing the procedures, if you recall, there are only 2 processes in the closing process group. One is this, close out all procurements, so they're clean and done. You have no outstanding issues or litigations. If you were to have those, you want to really try and avoid litigations if you can. And the second closing process or activity is in integration management, which is close a phase or the entire project itself. So only those 2 activities in the closing group. Here's our knowledge area process group grid again from table 3-1 with a slice of knowledge area 12. And like everything else, we know planning goes in planning. How about conduct? We're conducting, we're doing things, we're actively executing the procurement management plan. So therefore, conduct procurements is one of the, remember, one of the 8, I believe, executing processes in the process group executing. Controlling procurements appropriately goes in the monitoring and controlling process group. And finally, we have closed procurements, one of the only 2 of them that go in the closing process group. So let's talk about this. Here we see our knowledge area overview here. Obviously, it makes sense, but we need to say it anyway. All procurements must meet project needs. You need to be careful. There may be an instance where you would say, I need to buy this stuff from an outside supplier, and why don't I buy some extra stuff in case I need it? Maybe I need it. Maybe your risk plan says you may need something extra, whatever it is, but you're not to do that unless that extra stuff is actually in your WBS, properly classified as extra stuff, if that's what it is. The point is, don't buy what you don't need and what is not within your scope baseline. It says here the processes here, all these processes are repeated for each and every purchase or item required. Now that's not saying that if you have a purchase order for 10 items to supplier B, you're not going to go through this process 10 times. You'll go through it once for that purchase order, and if you have 15 purchase orders you issue, you will do these processes 15 times. It's unique to the commitment. Now, these commitments, purchase orders, you say, well, why don't you just say the right name? Well, there are many names depending on the nature of the procurement. It could be an agreement, a contract, a purchase order, the memo of understanding we talked about. It could even have other names than this. But the point is, once you get it, it's a legally binding document. And any one of these types of agreements or contracts, whatever you want to call them, they have a life cycle. And pretty much you can see here how a life cycle would play out. So here when you plan, you do your plan, and down here, and again up here where we say these processes are repeated for every purchase, doesn't mean you have to issue 15 procurement management plans. You have 1 procurement management plan. However, for every unique purchase or commitment, you do need this procurement statement of work shown under outputs, point 2. Every procurement needs a procurement statement of work, which is the primary document where you go out and you solicit your bids, your quotations, so that you can place that order. So that is where everything would repeat within the plan itself. Everyone has a statement of work. Now this project procurement statement of work is a project document, okay, so you could append it to your plan so you have an ongoing list of what you know, of those items, and later on you can match it up with the actual commitment there. But the formal documents reside within your procurement department, because they will manage all that procurement for you based on, you know, these statements of work and everything else. So keep that in mind. Now, and then conduct procurements ends up in an agreement or other names, you know, contract, purchase order, whatever it is. So statement of work, you go through this is a multi-use activity process here, conduct, because many things go on. First, you know, you pair out, you know, suppliers that are not capable, and you come up with a selected supplier list. You go out and you get bids. You know, you have your bid meetings, and then finally you actually place an agreement or a purchase order. That's the agreement. And then, you know, nothing stays the same. Basically, it's very rare that you place an order and it just comes in as you ordered it. You know, there are change requests. Now, these change requests here, which is under the controlling, executing, or monitoring and controlling process group, these are not the same change requests that we've been talking about all throughout the other knowledge areas, which are internal change requests to make corrective or preventative action, defect repairs, those kind of things. These are change requests between you and your supplier to change that purchase order on a legal basis. So that's what those change requests are. And finally, when you're done, you down here under closing, you close out each and every procurement cleanly. You cannot actually close out the entire project, which is the second of the two closing group process. You can't, if you have open litigation in court, you really can't close a project. So you want to avoid litigation at all costs. You need to use your skills in negotiation and all that stuff to avoid that if there's conflicts, disagreements with your procurement documents. So we'll talk about that in more detail coming up. So next, right after a life cycle of an agreement here, we say that all procurement vehicles, no matter what they are, have a very strong, legally binding verbiage in there between both the buyer, you, and the seller, whoever that may be. A little less strict if it's a memo of understanding between you and another part of your organization, that you have an agreement where they will provide you with stuff within the organization. It's not necessarily that legal, but it is an agreement nonetheless that you then need to have fulfilled, make sure it's fulfilled properly. So, you know, any of these things obligates the seller, whoever that is, or even internally with an MOU, to provide some value to you with some kind of deliverable from them, and not necessarily internally, but certainly externally, suppliers, you are obligated as a buyer to compensate them fairly for what the services that they provide you, and that's all in the purchase order or contract or whatever vehicle it is. And again, more names for the same kind of thing. You know, it could be a seller, a contractor, a subcontractor, a vendor, a service provider, a supplier. You know, they all mean the same kind of thing in the context of they're providing you a service and you're compensating them for it. And there are different ways of providing that compensation too. Some provide incentives for them to perform better, and we'll see those coming up. There's quite a few of them. And you'll have to know them all too, so you can act intelligently on PMP questions. Also, the buyer may be, from the seller's perspective now, if I'm the seller and you are the project performing organization, you are my client. Okay, you are my customer, you are my contractor, my prime contractor, you're the acquiring organization for me, the seller, to give you goods in that regard, and we're going to look at that a little more coming up. So the basic life cycle, seller's life cycle, from me, my point of view, to you, the project, is, you know, I will get the procurement statement of work, I'll give you my bid, my proposal. To fulfill that, you will select me, hopefully, and then we'll enter into a contracted agreement where I will provide you and you will pay me. That's pretty much what it is. So we're going to take a little break here. When we come back, we're going to actually talk just one more time about the different perspective from the seller's point of view toward the project you. Okay, let's just this one last time look at procurement from the seller's point of view, because you need to know this perspective. It's helpful. So here we say, from the seller's point of view, let's say I'm the seller, I'm providing you a gadget that you need, that's one of your activities that needs to be fulfilled. You, the buyer, now become my customer, okay, and you, as a project, are a stakeholder to me. So I need to, just like any stakeholder with you and your stakeholders, I need to understand perfectly your expectations. We have to have a constant dialogue so that we keep things on track. And if I have problems, you're going to do an issue on me as your stakeholder, because now I am your stakeholder, you are my stakeholder in this legal context of an agreement or purchase order or whatever you call it. So now I, now that I have an order from you, I need to produce a deliverable just like you need to produce your project deliverables. So I need to, manage my work just like a project you would at least hope that I would, so I can give you a good quality product, yeah, including quality and all that stuff. So you and I need this dialogue, and even before we enter into our commitment, if it looks like I am your successful provider, we need to have a dialogue so that you can really make sure that, I'm going to conduct my work to provide you with the quality product that you need. So it's a two-way street, this whole thing, buyer-seller relationship. And because our relationship now is a legally binding circumstance, we have terms and conditions in the project. It could be my terms and conditions that you've just agreed to. You may have imposed your terms and conditions on me, and I may not like that, but we need to come and negotiate it out, and finally we have an agreeable set of terms and conditions, which are things like, liabilities and warranties and disclaimers, whatever it might be, protection of property, intellectual property, all that stuff's in terms and conditions. Though that could be very fine, legalese, it's all there. But once we agree, that's a key input to our processes. So always keep in mind that, just because you buy something from somebody, and you wait for it to happen, you need more than that. You are mutually stakeholders of each other, and you have to go through the same kind of processes to assure that, we're all on board, we understand the same thing, we're talking the same language, and when I do deliver to you a quality product, then you can finally compensate me according to the agreement. So here's our knowledge area overview again, just to remind you here, we're going to talk about these two processes now. Our plan, which includes the project or procurement statements of work, and then conduct procurements, which is a multiplexing kind of, or multi-purpose process. It does a lot of things, not just placing the order. You got to get to that point where we'll see how we issue for bids and review the bids and select a supplier and then place the order. So here is our data flow diagram. Let's look at it. Of course, our project management plan, which has our scope baseline primarily, comes in. We have our requirements documentation, which is a higher level, more broadly framed requirements than the specific scope baseline in the WBS in there, just as a sounding board. And it may have, the requirements here, this document may have certain technical things in it called out in there that you need to know because it may have a bearing on the procurement documents that you prepare for bid. Of course, the risk register comes in whenever you're talking with a third supplier that you really have no control over directly, then risk is there, especially if it's a complex kind of technical piece of equipment or something perhaps, or highly complex and proprietary, say, application code, you're having a third-party code for you. Risk is always there, more so now when you're doing procurements. So you have to counter those and manage them like we do any risk, including proper response plans. What if I go out of business or there's a strike in my company as supplier, and now you're stuck? You're not going to get what I want to give you because I can't give it to you. So what's your response for that? Activity resource requirements come in. People, schedule, of course, comes in because, whatever I'm providing you, I need to do on your terms, on your schedule. So you got to make sure that I can actually do that, obviously, before you place an order with me. Cost estimates come in. These are sounding boards. Again, you've estimated your cost for this item, and now I'm going to give you an actual bid. If you say this is $500 and I say, no, it's going to be, $2,000. Why? Well, your technical requirements require it. So you look at the second bidder, and he's $2,000. Well, maybe I'm right. And now you look at a third bidder, and he says, okay, $600. Why the disparity? Now you got a real quality question in your head. What's the difference between what he would give me and what this guy's going to give me? What's the difference? Am I going to get a good quality product or not? Low bid, as we know from all the jokes about government purchasing and the Saturn rocket, how hard it is for an astronaut to be sitting on top knowing that everything was low bid. There has to be a quality component in there. You have to assess that before you actually place it for that $600 so you're sure that you're going to get the same quality as the other fella. So difficult decision sometimes. Hopefully not life-threatening, but in essence, still, for the success of your project, you want to make sure whatever you get meets your exact requirements and quality metrics. And that's just another point. Let me just point out, you know how when you on your project deliver things, it goes through quality, you do your metrics, make sure it's within tolerance. The same thing with their product. When they deliver, you're going to, either right then and there, you're going to go through some metrics to make sure it's right, or you may have people resident or visiting that plant who goes out there on a periodic basis and watches them build this thing, watch how they're doing their quality management. There's a big heads up. Again, prevention before inspection. Just like you don't want to deliver a final product to your client and have them find a product, you don't want them to deliver their product to you and then you find a problem with it. Same thing, big problem. You don't want that to happen. So however you want to handle quality is up to you to get what your project needs, but it works now in a buyer-seller relationship rather than just internal with your company. So cost estimates come in, again, for the reason of, a sanity check, basically. Stakeholder register, you come in, again, you may have, I say this and you know, it may be true, you may have stakeholders who have a vested interest. Maybe they're a big shareholder of a company and they say, well, I want this company to get this work. You know, or they have a buddy in the president of ABC Manufacturing and they play golf every Sunday. You know, you say, sure, I'll get you the work. You know, and now you're dealing with a conflict with your stakeholders because they want somebody, but your bids say, no, we ought to give it to somebody else. So, you know, all these problems exist, and that's why you have your job as a project manager to resolve these issues, smooth them over, negotiate them so that everybody is basically happy. You never want to win-lose or lose-lose. You really want win-win somehow. So that's your job to try and make that happen because you never know who knows who, where, and for what their motivation is, which is the whole essence of stakeholder engagement. Understand their motivations to help you address them properly. Let's see. Requirements, we talked about requirements coming in. So the outputs, the main outputs are your procurement documents, which would include your statement of work, and that's over here. Statement of work, procurement statement of work. Make-buy decisions, you're going to buy it, really, or you're going to make it in-house. That comes in as to why you're doing things, and it eventually goes down into actually conducting procurements. And of course, a natural outcome of planning is change requests to make internal changes and corrections, whatever, before you actually place stuff. But that's a big overview. So document project management decisions. Whatever you do, document them, make sure they're part of the project record. You're going to specify what kind of procurement approach, that would be make or buy, and then you identify potential sellers in here. So let's go on and get a little more detail. We're going to take a little break, and then we're going to talk about the actual inputs, techniques, tools, and outputs. Okay, here's our ETO diagram. Primarily, here's what we're trying to do. What happens here in 12.1 in planning management, down here, the purpose here is to determine whether we're going to buy something or not. We do that through make-buy decisions. What it is we're going to require. Well, we do that with our incoming activity costs, requirements register, and in particular our scope baseline. What are we going to buy? How are we going to buy it? Through what purchase vehicle? Okay. How much is needed? We get that, of course, from our scope baseline and documents, and it will be reflected over here in our final procurement statement of work. And when to acquire it, we get that from our project schedule, which will also be part of the statement of work. So that's what the essence of what this process does. And it also includes, even under planning, okay, not in conducting, but in planning, evaluating potential sellers. Do we want to even consider these people before we go out for bid? And we need to deal with permits, licenses, stuff like that, depending on intellectual property or things we need to do. If they're going to sell stuff to us, are they going to retain some kind of rights to it? Do we need a permit to use whatever it is that we're going to buy? Or even within our own company, if it's MOU, do we have rights to use this properly? All those things are considered here in the plan. Of course, the make-buy, risk evaluations for make-buy, I mean, that's really why you're doing make-buy, not just financial, but also risk. Maybe it's risky for us to do it, to build it. So we want a third party to, share that risk. Remember, sharing risk, they can share the risk by having them build it. And then, of course, risk response strategies. With any procurement, you have a lot of risk involved because you have no control over stuff directly. So, inputs, the PM plan. Primarily the scope baseline. Remember, you need to know this for the PMP exam. I'll just memorize it, and you hopefully have it by now. There's 3 pieces to the scope baseline. The scope statement itself, the actual WBS with our decomposed work activities, and then its companion dictionary with who, what, when, how kind of thing at that level. Requirements document may have legal or contractual limitations in the requirements that are specified at that level, and you need to be aware of those because they would have an influence over your procurement statement of work that you issue for bid. Of course, then your risk register, all procurement-related risk responses and risks would be dealt with there. Your activity resource requirements as people, location, equipment, especially equipment if we're going to subcontract or rent equipment, or even buy equipment, that's all your resource activities, that's the resources at the detailed level. Cost, of course, relative to that is a good reasonableness of proposal cost, as we said earlier. If it's $500, we thought, and he's $600, and the other 3 are $2,000. Well, there's something going on there. Why is that disparity? You need to understand what that is, make an intelligent decision. Of course, your project schedule is when we need it. Okay, and there may be mandated dates where you got to make sure a supplier can do it, and there may be penalties in the procurement document if they miss that date. Okay, very critical stuff here. And of course, the stakeholder register, again, is if the stakeholders have an influence over either your own internal procurement or external suppliers, your golf buddies, for example, again. Environmental factors at play, obviously in this case, more than maybe others, the marketplace itself is what you learn. You learn about organizations that you may place orders with. Do they have a good reputation? Have we had trouble with them? What do other people think? What are they in the industry? Are they a main player, a niche player? Or are they just, and do they need, maybe in their organization they're thinking about making a new plant or upgrading. Remember that? They may be doing that themselves. But marketplace is a big component here now when we talk about procurement. And I mentioned supplier reputations and the terms and conditions of purchase. Again, we don't have any control over, but we may be able to negotiate what we need from the supplier there. And our internal, or our organizational process assets. It's possible that if your organization, you're small enough or whatever, you do not have a dedicated procurement department per se, it's possible that you as the project team may act as a procurement entity in itself, and you may do all the procurements. And we're going to talk about a little detail about that you need to be aware of that may save you failing one of the questions. And we'll talk about it in 12.2 when we get there. Now, here is where you determine which types, for each procurement, you need to determine which type of purchase vehicle you're going to use, and there are quite a few of them. And unfortunately, you need to know, maybe not in detail how they operate, but you need to understand what the differences are between the various options with procurement vehicles you have. So we're going to take a little time and look at that as soon as we come back. Okay, so now we're going to look at the various options you have with procurement vehicles that just depend on the nature of the procurement, your relationship with the supplier, the urgency you may have to get something done by a certain time, so there may be incentives involved and things like that. So let's look at all these, and again, don't be overwhelmed with all of them, but just be aware they are, what they are, and how they fit into the context of procurement where you may have a choice between them. There's several different types. There's fixed price contracts. $300 for this item, that's what it is. Now there are flavors of this though. There's the firm fixed price purchase order or contract. This is the one that's most commonly used. You have a list of items, they all have unit prices, you times the quantity, total it up, that's what you're going to get. No change, no messing around, the most common. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, if the scope changes, quantities change, you add delete items on it because of what your project is doing as you adjust your scope. You don't even need to adjust your scope. Maybe you overlooked, or now some item in your activity schedule and your work breakdown can appropriately now be also added to a purchase order that you didn't add earlier. So really no change in scope there, but you would need a formal change request. And in the procurement environment, they most often actually call that a change order because you're changing an order. So change request, change order would be issued to the client to add that item in or to change a quantity or to delete an item off. It could be that you say, well, they may have a little trouble. The vendor may say, this is kind of weird. We may have trouble. Do you want to add another month on? You say, no, we're going to cancel that from you through a change order and then place another order with another supplier that could give you that one item, for example. Very dynamic, this whole procurement environment. Then you have something called the same thing, fixed price, but you have an incentive fee. Now, if there's a ceiling price, you may say, here, fixed price, you can't go over it, and if they do, they're still obligated to complete. No matter what it costs the seller, they're still going to pay you only $500. They bid it, it's a firm fixed price contract, it's in the terms and conditions, so they know in their own, like me, if I'm the vendor, I know, well, I really need to perform and get this done within my cost that I bid, otherwise my company's paying for it. I'm still only going to get $500 from you. There may be performance incentives that says, maybe it's like, if you can get this 2 weeks earlier than what you proposed, we'll give you a 5% bump on your price. That's the incentive. So if that's what you need on your project, you really would like to have it earlier if possible, maybe the vendor can work overtime or something. Still going to cost them the same, but they can take the overtime out of the incentive if that's to their advantage. Another one, not very rarely used, these are used, well, first, it's the fixed price with economic price adjustments. And again, watch out, because the PMP exam, being what they are, they may just give you these abbreviations. So you need to know what an FP-EPA is. It's not Environmental Protection Agency, no. It's economic price adjustment. These are for purchase orders that are a long lead time that usually go over a year on large. Like if you're building a power plant, you have to get a steam generator. Those could take years to build. So that would apply like in that instance. So the seller's performance is greater than a year, and what the adjustment is for inflation, cost of material. You can get statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on, inflation and cost of products and all that stuff. So you may have to apply, after a year, you say, okay, we're going to bump it. The new indice for this last year was a 5% inflation. We're going to bump the price up 5%. Just do it because that's part of your terms and conditions if that applies. So these are the three main fixed price contracts or purchase orders. And now we have cost reimbursable, where we place an order for a cost, but if the costs go up according to our terms and conditions, we just pay the extra to the seller so that they're not losing money. We already know that may be the condition. There's reasons to do that. One of them is a cost plus a fixed fee. the seller, me, if I'm the seller, you pay me for all my allowable costs in the procurement state of work and in the purchase order and the terms and conditions. You know, we'll pay you for these kind of costs that it takes you to provide my product. And again, we could take days going through all the intricacies of all of these types of vehicles, and we're not going to do it, but from a perspective of PMP exam, you need to know these basic things. So they're going to pay me for all allowable costs. If I go and make something really fancy, for one, it might be out of scope. We don't want it, but yet that's money I spent. You're not going to give it back to me because I wasn't allowed. Okay, and also fixed completion fee. At the end, when I turn it over, there may be, say, when you turn this over, I'm going to give you $500 extra, or 2%, whatever it might be, at the completion of work. And this, no matter how well or poorly I perform, if I'm late, whatever it is, as long as you get this product, because you're willing to pay me an incentive or this fee to get it. Now here is the actual incentive fee for cost reimbursable. Again, you'll pay me for all allowable costs in the contract. However, you and I as buyer and seller will share some costs relative to the performance objectives that you give me as the seller. So if I meet certain objectives, you know, the price may go down a bit, or you may give me a fee. It's all detailed in the terms and conditions. Again, it's pretty complex, these kind of things. It's hard to really explain here, but understand, though, that this is a shared, the incentive fee could be a shared fee and cost relationship between us based on performance, as opposed to the cost plus fixed fee, which is independent of my performance. This one is actually based on certain performance objectives, the incentive fee. Then there's the CPAF, cost plus award fee. Now this is a little different in, notice it says seller paid all legitimate costs. It's not allowable. There's a fine difference here. The allowable, it's specified, you know, we'll pay you whatever you get cost to build this in these allowable parameters. But here it's legitimate. This is like, you don't know what it might be, but if I say I had to spend, you know, $2,000 to do this to provide you a good product, if that's legitimate, okay, then you'll pay me. And you can see all the legalities and the negotiations and the conflicts and the disagreements that could come from all these things. That's why you have to have a really good purchasing department, a really good tight terms and conditions. That's another reason, even though the procurement or the project management team could act as a provider or purchasing arm, you don't really want to do that because you really may not have the skills to get all these crazy things, especially if it's a more highly complex, high visibility project with technical, really detailed kind of deliverables. But anyway, you'd pay me for all legitimate costs, and I would get a fee at your discretion based on, you know, how I performed or for whatever reason. I may get nothing, but you think that you really did well, these legitimate costs were good and reasonable, you give us a great product, here, have an award, good job. I gotta say thank you very much, put it in the bank. Different type, so this cost reimbursable. Now there's one last classification of procurement vehicles, time and material. And it's a hybrid between the other two, fixed price and cost reimbursable. Primarily this is used like to augment staffing. You know, you bring subcontractors on to help you for an indefinite perhaps period of time or for a 6-month contract or whatever, and then you release them. So that's one of the main reasons that you use time and material. But it's also when precision statement of work, you know, you want your procurement statement of work to be as tight as you can so that, you know, your supplier can build it or provide exactly what you need. So when you have a less clear statement of work, you would use this type of contract because, you know, some things, some part of it, you'll know, here's the money we're going to spend for these things, but the rest, you know, let us know what it's going to cost, and then we may pay you extra for that. So some things you just don't know in advance until you actually start to design it and build it elsewhere. And generally these are open-ended. They're, you know, like a staff augmentation. You may have a time and material contract with a headhunter organization where they provide you expertise, subject matter experts that you call upon, and we've talked about this all through these knowledge areas. Maybe this is an instance where you do just call them up, say, I need your best expert to help me do, well, maybe procurement management. And they will provide it because they have an open-ended contract, which is another reason when we do the project charter in the beginning, if you have one of these time and material contracts available, that would be one of the agreements. Remember, why are our agreements way up in the beginning? Project charter. Here's a good example of why you may have an agreement, which is a big influence on how you would then manage to carry out the project. So they're open-ended. They're just there for, well, open-ended, there would be a limit perhaps, you know, after a year we need to renegotiate our contract with the organization, but they're generally just open-ended. They're at your discretion. You say, I need it. They come in, you release them, they're gone, and whatever it costs, time and material, you pay them. And you'll have payment schedules on how much the hourly rates are and stuff, but you won't know what it is until you actually get somebody in. Oh, they're at this hourly rate. So that's time and material. So here they are. Fixed price, cost reimbursable, and time and material. Seems easy. just 3 basic types of purchase vehicles. However, when you get down and you atomize them a little more to the next level, they are very discrete things. So you need to understand these as well as those abbreviations in case that's all they say in a quiz question. Okay, so this is kind of confusing, but hopefully it's a little clearer now. Again, research the PMBOK, go out on the web, go to your procurement department if you have a question, ask them to explain this stuff to you because they're the experts. Okay, so when we come back, we're going to actually now just quickly go through the inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of planning your procurement management. Okay, so let's talk about the specific inputs here in planning procurement management. We have your procurement management plan. Oops, go back. Have your procurement management plan. We know what's, by now, since we're in our last module anyway, we should know by now what the components of a good project management plan are and all the subsidiary plans and baselines, so we're not going to detail those. Likewise, we talked about the requirements document, which is the summation of all your stakeholders' expectations wrapped up in a broadly framed document that is used to prepare your detailed work breakdown structures in your scope baseline. Your risk register, as we should know by now, a list of all identified risks and response plans as appropriate for the high critical risks that you feel you may need a response for. That's your known unknowns. And also with their associated contingency plans, and then a fund for or contingency reserves, rather, for those known risks, and then management reserves for all the unknown unknowns that you haven't even thought about. Activity resource requirements, again, WBS broken down into very discrete work efforts with costs and resources and time associated that are translated up, sometimes aggregated a bit, and brought up into your project network schedule diagram as activities that have been sequenced with your finish to finish, start to start, and then you put arbitrary leads and lags so it adjusts and morphs to what you need because you may have constraints somewhere, so you got to do all that kind of stuff. And then of course the resource part of it is the human resource or the materials that you need to accomplish that item. And mostly here we're talking about the materials part of it that you may have to place purchase orders for to complement and fulfill those particular activities. The cost requirements, very similar. You estimate the cost there, and pretty soon you'll know the actuals once you get the bids and you place an order. Project schedule, obviously, you need is an input because that is your timing, presents your timing and when you need these things delivered, so you don't delay other areas that are dependent on that deliverable from an outside source, or even within your company with an MOU. In fact, sometimes even within your own company is more difficult than getting something from an outside company because, with an MOU, you're not necessarily and most likely not legally bound. It's an ethical professional obligation that they'll give you what you need to fulfill your project. So that may be a more difficult vehicle to manage than a third party who's legally bound, who's looking for a financial compensation. So watch out for that. Stakeholder register, as we know how terribly critical that is, the attitudes of your stakeholders, their risk tolerances, their alliances, and all that stuff enter into your planning procurements. And your organizational process assets and environmental factors, here's an instance where they just all apply. Like PMBOK says, sometimes no matter what it specifically may state, and of course not limited to, and in their eyes, not limited to means everything. So consider everything out there in the environment that could affect procurement. Marketplace conditions, stock prices, if some company's stock is dropping, why would that be? Well, it might be their shareholders are just losing confidence in the company. They may have not met their financial estimates for the quarter. Forget it, I'm going to dump them and go somewhere else. Well, that's one thing, but now that their shareholder goes down, their whole company net worth goes down, the morale of their people may go down, they may not be caring about a new job, everybody may be wanting to jump ship, so all these things you got to consider regardless of what's specified in the PMBOK. Tools and techniques, make, buy, a big one here because this determines whether you're going to place an order or build it in-house. Things you consider obviously would be the availability of your internal resources to do it and the skills that they have to do it versus an organization who does that for a business. Budget constraints, maybe you can't spend extra money to get it outside, you can just wash it somehow through your internal organization. And direct costs, indirect costs, you need to consider lease, you're going to purchase it or lease, different kind of financial vehicles and obligations there. And risk sharing between making and buying, consider all that. So basically the bottom line is during planning procurement, and again, for every purchase order or candidate purchase order, rather, set of whatever the scope requirements is you need to buy, you need to consider all this for each one of them. Are you going to make it this or are you going to buy it? Okay, once again, expert judgment. And now here's where you may want legal help. Real legal help from either internally, your legal department, or go to that contracting outfit that we have a contract with, call in a legal expert to look over your procurement documents, give you advice. It can be very, very complex, and it could be very, very detrimental if you miss something major and the problem is down in the end and later on, and the seller says, well, sorry but tough. You can't do anything to us. There's no recourse for you in our terms and conditions. Got to be really careful. Talk to prior project managers, especially concerning particular suppliers you may be considering, or even internally. How did that MOU work with your department, that department over here? Did they work with you? Did they provide you what you need? Or do we really have to spend 5% more and buy it from somebody and just be done with them? Those kind of advice. And you're going to be talking to sellers too. You got to watch out for conflict of interest, but at this stage of the game, you can go ask for anything, any advice. Give me your technical stuff, you know, a sample so we can look at it. Whatever you want, expert advice. Market research, of course, is a big thing, sort of like, you know, looking at a company, looking at their product, their history, you know, how are they doing better, they're doing worse, stuff like that. Industry, vendor capabilities. Go to conferences, you know, online reviews and tech conferences if that's the kind of thing you'd be buying. Look around, see, you know, you may be looking for providers, suppliers. You may not know who to go to. These conferences are great. And they'll just cling on you. You know, they'll come and they'll cling all over you. Okay, let me go look at your stuff. But you can get a lot of information prior to bidding with that kind of deal and just all that market research. And then meetings. You may call in potential bidders to have them give you a spiel. Again, from a very neutral point of view, no conflict of interest, no patronage. You got to really avoid that. You know, later on, you don't want to get accused of that. That could be very bad. That could end up with legalities and litigation where a seller could say, no, I'm going to bid this job because there's collusion over here, and that's not good. So avoid that at all costs. So, but you can go have meetings. You know, show me what you got. Give me all your tech. Okay, thank you. You know, we'll be in contact with you if we think this is appropriate for us, and they're gone. Avoid conflicts of interest. Outputs. The procurement management plan. You will specify the standard type of contracts that you think you'll be using. Again, you know, you could change this. You could add more, take more off as you go on through the project if it's appropriate. But basically, pick what the kind of vehicles you want. Risk management issues, you know, bonds and insurance, transfer risk to others. Project team, are you authorized to act on behalf of procurement? Or if you have no procurement, you should do it yourself. Now, here, I want to show you this. You should all, again, have this in your hand. And if you're a member of PMI, you will be able to download a legal copy of this in Adobe format, PDF. But if you have this in your hand, open it up. I want to just point something out. This may save you a failed question. Go over there to well, actually it's page 377. Look in 12.2.2.7. Okay, and right down here in the last paragraph right there, read this. It says, the project manager may not be the lead negotiator on procurements. Project manager may not be the lead negotiator. What does that mean? Think about that. You may not be, or is it, I remember we talked about body language. Is it you may not be, or is it you may not be, but you might? Okay, I've done a lot of research on it. This is one of those other rare but still vague statements in PMBOK. I've done research on my associations and the forums, gotten a lot of good expert advice myself for this, and the overwhelming actually consensus is that you may be, but you might not, but you could be. So if you were to get a question like this, if PMBOK were to realize what they said, they're trying to quiz you, the answer would be yes, you could act as the negotiator on a procurement, as project manager and as the team, but you might not be. So it's really the consensus is they're not saying you cannot ever be. They're saying you might be. I don't know why they didn't use the word might, but they didn't. So keep that. If that does come up, you'll be glad you heard this, because it'll save you a question. So, where were we? There we are. Procurement management plan, it coordinates procurements with cost and scheduling. You know, because when you make a purchase, you got to go to your finance people and make sure that that piece of money that when it gets delivered is going to end up in your funding requirements, for example, and that your schedule reflects their deliverables and vice versa in the right period of time. Long lead time items, again, have a big consideration. They're way more risky when they're way out in the future for a lot of reasons, but you know, pay attention to those. Linking make-buy decisions with activity resource estimates and project schedule. Again, that helps you do this, and you can have some linkage, some verbiage in your plan and why you made certain decisions for make-buy, of course. Pre-qualified sellers. You may have your organization, especially if it's a federal or a governmental agency, they may have a list of already pre-qualified providers for certain classes of equipment to the exclusion of others. So those others have to go through quite a bit of rope climbing and jumping through hoops to get onto that list. So you know, if you have this pre-qualified list, that saves you some time, but you need to know if that's available to you. And then metrics to evaluate and mange the sellers. So you're going to trim their hair, you're going to mange them. Actually, it's manage the sellers. So metrics, how are you going to do it? It's all in the plan. So that's the procurement management plan. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and talk about the procurement statement of work. Okay, here we are with procurement statement of work, and just before we start talking about that, I'm going to flip back one slide. Down here, it is metrics to evaluate and manage sellers, not mange them. We're not going to tear their hair out, although if they don't perform, we may want to tear their hair out. But it's manage sellers. Okay, so here we are, procurement statement of work. For each and every procurement that would have one-to-many items in it that we need, very specific specifications that we would get from our requirements document, from our scope baseline, from our WBS dictionary, wherever we can get those, which ultimately came from our requirements from our stakeholders and their environment. Very specific specs. Of course, we need quantities, quality requirements you have to have in all procurement documents so that we have our sellers thinking about and executing quality management techniques in their organization so that we don't reject something that comes in to us and back to them as bad as us. Same thing, if we give our final product to our client, we don't want them finding defects. Performance requirements on how that item would perform, on how we want their organization to perform, could be any kind of these performance kind of related things. Maybe the work location has some sensitivity to it where they would build this product. You know, that would, if it's again an older plant, maybe we're getting something out of Bangladesh because that's the only place in the world that produces this unique thing for us. You know, the working conditions there may not be what we would consider the best perhaps. So we need to have verbiage in each procurement that would compensate for those things and how we would expect that to be managed. And maybe we'd even say, you are not, if you know, Mr. Seller, you're not allowed to use these 3 plants, but if you produce it in these other 2 plants, that's fine with us, because then we have better confidence, or whatever it might be. Maintenance support requirements also is another big deal. If you're getting a piece of equipment, say, or even software, if a third party, if they're going to maintain the code for you over time, or just, you know, how would you maintain this piece of equipment once you get it in? You need to make sure that you get the proper maintenance documentation, recommendations, techniques, costs of spare parts, and all that stuff you may need. So all this stuff for each procurement you need to consider in the procurement statement of work. And this is the document that you would send to the potential bidders for them to provide their cost proposals to you. Statement of work. Probably the key output of this whole process is the procurement statement of work. And procurement documents themselves now are what would convey the statement of work to the vendors along with these other things. Because now you're going to solicit proposals. You're going to say, here's a statement of work, tell me how much it's going to cost if I buy it from you. So, and again, when you do this, again, here's another instance where there are many names to the same thing, you know, bid, tender, quotation, proposal, okay, when it's based on price, you know, and contracts for services might be called contract, bid, all sorts of names, whatever it is, don't get, you know, consider it in the context of what you're trying to buy. The proposal, when technical capabilities are paramount, you need to have a really tight proposal. And here's just some other names. Request for quotation, RFQ. Again, abbreviations, watch out, they may use those. Request for information. You may have a request for information as a prelude for an official request for quotation. Request for information would be the same as having the prospective bidders come in and you're asking and looking at what their offerings could be so you can make an intelligent decision of whether you even want to deal with them or not. You could request for information and then select who you want and then get the real request for quote. Sometimes it's even called an invitation for negotiation depending on the type of service. Perhaps this is mostly perhaps a service, but it could be a hard product. But you may just want to sit down with them, negotiate with them, negotiate, and then find out who's what. But again, conflict of interest in that kind of approach is very critical. You don't at all get in trouble with conflict of interest. Procurement, if you're especially a federal or a state agency, you know, you're going to need to publicize to the world that here, come out if you're interested in this job. You know, we'll let you tell us if you're interested to bid this, and you'll get all these inputs. Not to say that, you know, you wouldn't have a predefined list of sellers too, so you got to work all these things in combination as appropriate. Content and the structure of proposals may be mandated by your organization, which should be of no surprise, but federal government agencies may mandate to you as a company how your proposals, your request for bid would be structured and formatted. And of course, the prime thing you want to look at first is whatever organizational procurement policy you have, because a lot of these things then should be in there to help you so you don't have to like guess what you're going to do. Source selection criteria. So the source would be your bidders, and how you select them. Well, you can rate them, you can score them, you can do weighted this and that, checklists, all this stuff can be subjective, meaning they did a really good job. Next time, you know, sure, we want them to bid, or you know, well, we'll have them bid, but we really got to watch out because they did okay last time with us, but my buddy over in the other company, talking to him yesterday over dinner because we're friends, he said, boy, that company really messed him up. So subjective, you get these mindsets, and you got to consider this stuff. And objective, of course, is, you know, just fixed things that you can actually check off in a box against various bidders. And the selection is based only on price or the detailed assessment of them. You know, you don't want it just because they're your friend. You know, you can't like cook the books to give somebody work because they're your friend. It's got to be based on empirical data in front of you in a bid evaluation tally sheet, for example. Where do you get detailed source of criteria? Okay, we're going to walk through these just so you can see the myriad of information that you need to deal with when you, or if you're lucky enough, your procurement department will have to deal with. So we're going to come back and look at these in a minute. So here's I'll look at some detailed source selection criteria that you, if you actually are the lead negotiator, acting as a procurement entity in your company, or, well, let me rephrase it, it's either you and or your procurement wing of your company would need to deal with these things. You know, you need to understand the need to use these people, the overall life cycle cost of a product. You may need to get that kind of information when your bids come in. What are the technical capabilities of the organization to fulfill the need of this product that you want to go out and buy? Again, risk, what kind of risks are involved, management, technical approaches between you and the bidders, warranties, you know, what is their warranty? You know, is it 90 days and tough luck if it breaks, or is it, you know, a year, parts and warranty, parts and labor, whatever the warranty is, could have a big impact, all other things being equal, of who you select. What are the financial capabilities of the proposed sources, bidders? Are they a very stable company? Is it a Joe Blow, you know, job shop over here that may go out of business if they make a big mistake? You know, they're done. You know, you need to know these things, or at least make intelligent assessments and judgments about them. What are their production capabilities? Are they building it like, you know, Steve Jobs out of their garage? And, you know, as it turns out, that would have been a great deal. But, you know, you need to consider these things. Is it this guy doing it, mom and pop shop, or is it a nice modern factory to give you the same thing, which may actually cost more, but you get a more quality product? You know, how big are they? Is it Bob, or is it, you know, 5,000 organization company? Their past performance, obviously, and intellectual and property rights, proprietary rights. You know, this is a big deal. Make sure you don't overlook this. They may want to, if I'm a seller and it's a highly technical thing, I may license something to you. Remember licensing? I may license it and I retain the rights. Or I may sell it to you and have some verbiage in there that says, you know, you can't use this outside of your company, you can't reveal anything, you can't deconstruct it to see what's in it. You know, all this kind of stuff you need to consider regarding how you select your sources. Here's make-buy decisions again. You know, are you going to do it? Get it from the outside. Change requests, or more appropriately perhaps change orders. They're the same, but change orders is probably the word that's more used in the purchasing lexicon. So all decisions involving procurements of goods, services. Let me take that back. In this instance, we are talking about change requests here, because when you make a purchase, you should have a change request, just like changing out your staff. You need a record. And the best place to do it consistently is your change control board, because they have all the records, even if it's just changing Bob out on the staff. Similarly, okay, we placed an order with so-and-so, purchase order number, whatever it is, go see purchasing for the actual document. So here we're talking about that. Under conduct procurements and manage procurements, we'll be talking about the change orders. So changes to your PM plan and its subsidiary plans may raise procurement change requests. Okay, yeah, as your actual documents may change throughout the life cycle of your project for whatever reason, that may have an impact on items that you have out there bought. You need to consider whether you do need a change order maybe for them, or if you're in the bid phase or you're preparing your procurement statement of work, you may also need to make some adjustments depending on what happens with these. So you got to consider all that stuff. Project document updates. Your requirements document may be tweaked a bit. Maybe some technical requirement up there just can't be achieved by anybody, so you may need to skinny it down a bit and update it. And remember what RTM is in the context of requirements. That's your requirements traceability matrix. Yeah, that would then change accordingly with when you change your requirements document. They kind of pair up. And the risk register, of course, may change dramatically throughout all of this. As you finally select some source, then you may have a whole new list of risks. Or some risks may go away because you've picked somebody where, you know, the risk just is not an issue anymore. So those are your outputs of planning and procurement management. So now when we come back, we're going to look at actually conducting procurements, which is, you know, a multi kind of purpose activity here of selecting your proposed bidders, receiving the bids, evaluating them, making a purchase decision, and issuing the agreements. Okay, well, welcome back. Now we're going to look at process 12.2 of our project procurement management knowledge area, which is conduct procurements. And that, as we'll see, and as I mentioned before, this is a very obvious multi-purpose kind of process. So let's start looking. Let's look at the data flow diagram and some comments here. So what's the purpose here conducting procurements? Go out, get your bid, get your seller's responses, select the seller, apply source selection criteria, which is, you know, the attributes that you're going to apply against their proposals to see whether they've met the conditions and the requirements that you were set out to get from them. You're going to shortlist them, and then you're going to negotiate with them as needed so that, you know, in the end, you will know which of the ones you pick that you're in a good place as far as them meeting all of your requirements. And then you would actually, you know, award the contract or place an order, whatever, and here, rinse and repeat for every acquisition just like this. So here's our data flow here. The main inputs right here, other than your procurement management plan, which has all these criteria in it, procurement documents, what kind of purchase vehicle would you use for this particular now procurement which you may have in mind, or any procurement in general. The source selection criteria, which are your checklists, perhaps, if you want to characterize it that way, what you're going to look for in each bid. You know, if you've ever done procurement, really, you know, you have your crude, well, not crude, but the original way to do it was to have a ledger sheet. Your requirements down the side, your bidders across the top, and then you can mark the criteria, money across, or a response to certain attributes you need across the top, and you apply certain evaluations to all these in the bottom, and you come up with, you know, either the low bidder or whatever your criteria is to make a purchase. Make or buy decisions come in too, so this would, you know, like eliminate not going out to bid for certain things, whereas you're just going to do them yourself. And the big, again, one more last big enchilada is the procurement statement of work, which you would either send to bidders to bid on, or if it's an MOU, you may want to give it internally to some organization and say, here's what we require, can you meet this for us? Because we've decided that, you know, we're going to make it here in-house instead of go out and buy it. And if they can't do it, or they're not willing to do it, or don't have the time to do it, or whatever internally, then you probably have no choice but to go out and buy it out in the commercial world. Also coming in, all the project documents that may help you support that, and we'll get a little more detail on those as we look at the detailed inputs. Of course, process assets, you know, templates, order templates, bid templates, evaluation templates, sheets, those are the most obvious things you might get. So selected sellers, here's like the little process, at least at this data flow level right here. You select your sellers, they go out to bid for all your sellers, and they give you proposals. Pretty good, huh? And then you wash it in here and you end up with an agreement for them or an MOU, and then you control the result of doing that, and change requests may come out of there in the change control for reasons to adjust your processes because of what you learned throughout this whole process. So let's look at this. So we saw this before earlier. We'll just, you know, run over it again. You know, procurement documents, you get sellers' proposals come in, make-buy decisions, procurement statement of work, and why this is a multi-purpose activity here. 12.2 is kind of obvious here. You know, you're not going to get sellers' proposals in until you create you do your make-buy decision, and then you come up with your procurement statement of work. Then you go out over here to your selected sellers over here in outputs, you know, and then they come back in the front with their actual proposals, and then you come into tools and techniques. You have your conference, your techniques, and then finally you end up with your agreements, and then even later on you may come up with some sort of changes. So multi-purpose activity or process here. So this is the fundamental purchasing process right there shown. And remember, everything, this is a real good example of why everything is interactive and overlap in ways you really can't depict well. You can't tell what comes first here in a logical sense. But you know, your intelligence now with how these processes work, as well as any of the other processes in PMBOK, you're better able now to understand the relationships of things, even if they're all jumbled together like this. So, inputs. Your project management plan, we know what that is. Been through that. Procurement documents. Whatever pertains that you need to help you make decisions and issue vehicles is there. Source selection criteria, that's your benchmark against bids when they come in, so you can make sure they are meeting all of your requirements. You know, the sellers, this is the actual proposals that they send you. They say, here, we'll give you what you want for this amount of money under these certain conditions in this time frame. And they may have caveats. They say, however, these are excluded, we can't do this, or we could do this better, what do you think? Now, this is a real problem too, problem in the sense that you may now become overwhelmed with more options than you thought of in your procurement statement of work. So you do need to consider those, whether those are just innate with the requirements that you need, and yeah, okay, that is a better way to build it than Joe over here in that company. We're getting the same end result, but this is just a better way because of options. There may be optional pricing. Do you want this added on, this added on, this added on? That does not, it could, but it doesn't necessarily indicate scope creep. It could just be a better way of providing what you really want anyway. So you need to consider all these things, add them all up, and the bottom line is, you know, whoever is successful. Project documents, make-buy decisions. project documents in particular. Here now, the risk register, because now you're getting bids in. And these kind of things like bidders saying, you know, how about we add $50 to add this piece on, it still gives you what you want, and somebody doesn't, but they're less priced. So do you want that without this like added feature that still is equivalent to what you want? You wouldn't really maybe consider it scope creep or not. So that's a risk. You're taking a risk at either not getting this little piece or actually getting it. We're maybe, well, mostly not getting it. So, I mean, risk is involved in procurement, even in these matters and everything else. And if it's a low bidder and you like what they have, that's a risk. They're low. Just like the rocket thing with the astronaut. A low bidder, that's scary. You're sitting up there. You know, you'd rather have the highest cost rocket you're sitting on because you know, or at least you would perceive that quality and reliability and your life safety is better met by a higher quality product or a higher cost product. And that's not necessarily the case. So all these decisions you need to make before you buy. Of course, procurement statement of work, that's the fundamental vehicle that the bidder bids on. And process assets, prospective, previously qualified sellers, you can have a list of those in your organization, pre-qualified seller list, information about past seller performance that is documented. I mean, you can go out into your environmental factors out in the wild and you can get information on seller performance. But if your organization takes that intelligence and documents it in their databases, then that is a process asset. Of course, any prior agreements you had with a company who is a bidder that you're considering, you know, you may want to look what happened with that agreement. Inputs. So here's your tools and techniques. Bidder conferences. Again, conflict of interest is a big concern, so you have to do this the right way. And generally, what it is bidder conference. The focus here is after the bids have been received, and you know, you generally should have a bid closing date. You know, we're going to give you 2 weeks to bid. If it's a really complex, we'll give you a month. If it's a simple thing, you know, fax me your quote in 2 days. Whatever it is, you're going to have a closing date. And then you can call all those bidders into the same room all together. So, and totally aside from PMBOK here, there's a whole body of different knowledge out there about how to conduct meetings in these situations, how to arrange your room, how to arrange the chairs, who's looking in the corner, who's you know, all sorts of these psychological ways of situating a meeting room to get the best advantage and to avoid conflict. So that's an interesting thing if you're really involved in bidder conferences, to go out and look for some of these resources to help you actually set up a meeting room when you have bid conferences. Because you know, you don't want to sit Joe next to Bob, and so that, you know, you want to have something in between them perhaps, so they're not actually next to each other, so they can speak a little more openly. They're not, you know, intimidated, and you know, don't start arguing with their competitor next to them. But anyway, bid conferences, they're really good. They're all your prospective sellers now, where their bids are together. And the purpose here is so that everyone hears everyone else's questions and everyone hears your answers, or perhaps your procurement department's answers, or another meeting member would be, say, the legal department, about all terms and conditions. You want to get all that clarified in front of all the bidders so it's fair. No conflict of interest, nobody's left off, nobody, you know, and if they don't show up to the conference, well, that's their tough luck, you know, but this is their opportunity to hear from everyone. So, bidder conference. And proposal evaluation techniques. Complex procurements, you know, have a different set of techniques than very simple techniques. In fact, simple, you know, bill of materials for valves and piping, you may not even have a bidder conference. You just get their bids in, who's low bid. You know, if they meet your spec, you buy it. I mean, a valve is a valve, basically. But then you may have like weighted criteria, and you predetermine this when you come into the bidder meeting, or actually this is more like not the bidder meeting per se, it's when you're evaluating the bids. Some aspects of some of your requirements may have more weight, more importance than others. So you can weight them, and you can do a weighted matrix, put scores in, and in the bottom it all adds up and multiplies out, and here's your from the most compliant kind of a proposal to the least. And again, I mentioned Kepner-Trego KT analysis. If you want to use that, that's a really good one. You know, again, PMBOK doesn't even mention this, and they don't prescribe it, but it is a good one. So you might want to look at it or get something equivalent to help you do weighted analysis of these kinds of things. Independent estimates, of course, internal, external sources, your experts, your subject matter experts. They will help you, you know, benchmark proposals. It gets down to, you know, the $500 versus he bid 600 and they bid 2,000. You know, benchmark out there what the, you know, the world, the environment would expect for this kind of thing, and they say, why does it cost that much? Well, we put quality in it, all these inspections, so their cost of quality is way up in their organization. But if they can't sell it at that price, then it's lost money because nobody's buying their product. So, but it may not even be quality, maybe something else. But when you get that disparity, you really do want a sanity check, a benchmark on what is really the general kind of price frame that we're looking for. So things that are way out of whack, you really need to question. Here's expert judgment. Advertising. Okay, now again, we got the mixed kind of activities going on here in this one activity. So advertising can expand your potential list if you're allowed to get bidders that aren't already pre-qualified, and they may be mandated. So We're going to talk a little bit more now when we come back, take a little break, and then analytical techniques we'll talk about. Okay, well here we are back to talk further about tools and techniques in our procurement management knowledge area. Analytical techniques right here. Pretty much seller past performance information, analyze those. These are all preludes to selecting a successful supplier once we get their bids. Identify risk factors, their monitoring needs. We may have to put a permanent person in their facility to watch them build our product if that's what it takes. And of course you need your terms and conditions to allow for that. Determining their propensity to achieve objectives. Now this is a very high level statement here about analytical techniques, so I want to go back and show you once more a slide we saw just a few slides ago. And this is our source selection criteria. Now why I show this again is I want to make it clear, we also talked about pre-selected lists of sellers, and they are sources, seller sources. That is different than the source selection criteria. I want to make that clear, independent of who we're going to bid to. Once we receive the bids, we want to evaluate it against these kinds of attributes and characteristics. Remember I said we may even have a simple thing like a ledger sheet we fill out, although your project management information system may allow you to do a digital kind of entry of data and analysis of it. But regardless of how you do that, you're going to want to not only price and other criteria, but many other things that you may want to look at in detail that would, all other things being equal, let's say that the quality of the product they want to deliver is fine, they're all the same, the price is exactly the same, which won't be the case, obviously, usually, but let's say it is. So now, how do you make a selection? Well, there are other criteria, other qualitative criteria in many respects. So that's what this is again, source selection criteria. How are you going to select the source once you get the bid? Do they understand really your need and how they're fulfilling it? What is their overall life cycle? Once they buy it, you're not going to pay $500 and be done. You may pay $10,000 now for what it needs to function, so whatever that is. Technical capability of your sellers versus others. Risk, what's the difference of risk between one organization of the other or the other? How do they manage their organization? What are their technical approaches in their organization? Warranties can be all over the place maybe, so which is which. Are they financially stable? Are they a small company? Are they at risk of very vast stakeholder influences in their stock prices, which affects their bottom line? Production capabilities, of course, manual, robotic, if that's the kind of thing you're buying. Business size, mom and pop, 5,000 employee General Motors, or they're even bigger than that. Whatever it is, their past performance, of course, and intellectual rights. So these plus whatever else it is that you need to evaluate to intelligently pick one bidder over the other is the things you need to do. Now what you would do, this criteria and whatever else you may want to evaluate would be in the procurement statement of work, because you want the sellers to know what you're evaluating, and you're going to want to have them respond to you in their proposal with all this information so that you can take it, tally it up, however you do that, and then make your assessments accordingly. You can compare and contrast and see differences, and then you can ask questions like why. So now that is different than the bidder conference. Okay, now we're talking, well, let me prelude that with, now we're going to talk about procurement negotiations. The negotiations is with individual sellers once you have their proposals. Okay, it's not a bidder conference. The bidder conference is when all bidders were in the room and they all asked their questions. You gave them all universally recognized answers. Okay, and then they go off and they give you the proposals. And during that bidder conference, you may even have as a handout to them all this criteria. This is going to be in your proposal, your bid, or your request for bid rather. And we're going to expect you to respond to all these. Now they're going to ask questions. Well, what do you mean by that? Blah blah blah. And you answer them, and they go off and they give you the proposal, and then you start to evaluate them. Now once you have all that, you're going to pare it down to a short list by some criteria that you use, and you're going to maybe have 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 bidders individually either come in and talk to you, or you talk to them over the phone, or you have a video conference, or whatever it takes, to individually ask them questions to clarify their responses to these kinds of things. And if it gets down to really to a few, then you could possibly even start negotiating price. Okay, but now you're just talking to them. What's the best you can do here? Now, it's not good practice to start playing off each other. They say, okay, I'll give you a 5% reduction. You can't go to the next bidder and say, Joe gave me a 5% reduction. Can't do that. You ask the second guy, what can you do with your price? And the third guy, what can you do with your price, if that's what you're trying to do? You can't play one off each other. That is very bad practice. It's unethical, so don't do it. But you can sit down and talk to them very deeply about all these subjects, including price negotiation. You could say the industry says, remember our example before, the industry says this type of product, should be $500, and you're asking $2,000. Why? And they'll explain. If they can't explain, you knock them out. If they can't explain, maybe that's something you didn't consider and you want to leave them in the running. So procurement negotiations is really critical, and here it is. Contract responsibilities between people. What if whoever signs the order, goes away, and you may have authority figures in their production, a really great production manager, he'll get a good job done for them, then for you, and if he leaves, what happens? All these things you can ask, depending on the criticality and the complexity of the item that they're trying to build for you, and all that stuff. Scheduling, you're going to give us this in 6 months. I mean, that's within our schedule, but it would be really beneficial if we could get it early, because then we can move some tasks and help us. Can you do that? This is all very appropriate stuff, as long as you're fair. It's not conflict of interest. You don't play it off of everybody, and it's confidential between you and the bidder. Okay, you don't want anybody else talking to these people about this. And down at the bottom here it says, here's where earlier I whipped out the PMBOK, and I said, where it says the project manager may not be the lead negotiator, period. Well, what does that mean? Well, it actually really means the best expert advice, your expert judgment. We're even doing it right here in our project management environment. Says, yeah, that means you might not be, but you could be. So if you are, then you're doing all these things. If you're not, then your procurement department would be doing all these things based on your criteria you give them to negotiate. Okay, or you could even be in there with the procurement, but then they would be the lead, because they are actually the ones who are the subject matter experts in procurement, so you need to rely on them, defer to them for things, and you can then contribute. And it's certainly during negotiations, and this is a psychological thing too with the sellers, is that you and your procurement rep may say to the bidder, sit there a minute, I need to go talk, and you and the procurement person go outside. Even if you don't talk about anything, the seller is saying, oh, brother, I better give them a better answer. So there's a lot of psychology that goes on with procurement. I was in procurement myself for 20 years, so I mean these tactics work. So, but the whole bottom line is you got to be fair and no conflict of interest, but do things the right way and get the information you need so that you can make an intelligent decision to buy. So when all this is done, you're going to come up with a list of selected, well, again, 12.2 is a multi-purpose activity. So here, selected sellers, we're talking about pre-bid, where you select, well, let's see what we are. No, sorry, that was under manage, where we come up with our bidders list. So let me retract that. So here are your selected sellers, these people that you said, okay, here's the bottom line, all this stuff considered, however you want to weight it, however you want to evaluate it. You may score things and rank them, whatever it takes, depending on how you do things and how your organization recommends it be done, and maybe procurement will do it all for you based on your criteria. You'll come up with a very short list, or perhaps the seller. So are they within competitive range? Have you negotiated a draft contract? Because all this negotiation will get down finally to a draft contract where you would present to seller A and maybe seller B, maybe even seller C. But you don't want to waste a lot of time, because these contracts can be really complex. So you really want to start working with who you think you're really going to work with, because this is the bottom line when you give a draft contract to a seller, your prime candidate. So here's everything. Are you willing to sign this? Because I am. And they'll respond in kind. They may have to go off to their lawyers and come back, but eventually you'll get somebody to agree to some mutually agreeable point, and now you have a final selected seller. So what do you do then? Well, you actually formalize it by issuing a contract or an agreement or a purchase order or whatever you want to call it. Memo of understanding, contract, subcontract, purchase order. Okay, they're mutually binding between both of you. You need to perform by giving them what they need, and they need to give you what you expect, and then you compensate them for it. And your compensation is the product that you need to fulfill some activity in your schedule. Mutually binding. A lot of contract components. If you've ever been involved in procurement, you'll know that this is even a short list. But statement of work, their schedule baseline, how they report their progress, their performance. What periods do you want to know daily how they're doing? If it's that kind of thing, you want to know weekly, monthly, it's in the contract. Roles and responsibility of you, your staff, them as you interface with that, and even perhaps of your procurement department. You may have a representative, a project procurement manager, PPM, and not in PMBOK, but that's not an uncommon acronym, PPM, project procurement manager, who is looking out for your best needs against contracts that are issued. Of course, the pricing is in there, payment terms. It may not just be a lump sum, it may be a gradually scheduled payment, 50% now and 10% if you do this, do this, do this. From the final payment once we accept your deliverable, very common. Product support, once they deliver it, how are they going to support your product, or are you just going to buy materials and consumables and do it yourself, short of a warranty problem? Limitation of liability is in there, fees, retainers, penalties, incentives, insurances may be in there, performance bonds. If it's subcontractor kind of a thing you're obtaining, acquiring, those terms, how you're going to handle changes to the contract. Well, certainly for you it's going to be a change order through your change request system. It goes into procurement and they issue a change order. But how are they going to handle it on their end? You're going to have to get a bid from them to cover. Well, generally how it works is you send, here's a change request, change order, cost it for me. They'll give you the result. It would cost you this much. It's going to impact your triple constraint, because the scope may change if that's what it is, or certainly perhaps the cost will change and it may impact your schedule. So the triple constraint is always involved with change orders to your suppliers, change management. And if you have to, let me rephrase that. You always have to have a termination clause in case you have to cancel the contract for cause or not for cause, but you still have to have a termination contract that handles how you would cancel the contract. And ADR is your alternate dispute resolution. What if you start bickering about something? Your best intents on both sides was this is a great clean contract. You're going to get to a point perhaps where no, that isn't what I ordered. Well, yes it is. It's in here. Well, that isn't what that meant. Well, now you got a conflict. You got to resolve it. You don't want it to go to legal, and you certainly don't want it to go to court. If it goes to legal, your legal department, their legal department can hack it out with your participation as needed, but you really want to try and negotiate it out if possible. That's the best. It's sort of like the prevention before inspection, same kind of concept. Fix it now before it gets worse. So resource calendars are also an output because now you're buying things. Depending on when the stuff might get delivered, might have an impact on your skilled resources waiting for this thing to come in. That may have to be adjusted. You may want to know who on their staff is responsible for the contract to you and know their calendar so that when they're available, if you have to call them, if they're going to be out in Europe for 2 weeks vacation, you're going to need to know that in case you have to contact them. All this kind of thing. So resource calendars are important. And I mentioned this earlier, it's a fine point, but maybe you need to put a dedicated quality control person in their facility. So now you need to know what their plant hours are. What your whoever representative you send over, what their hours are. So you need to know all these. That's why resource calendars are in play here. Change requests. Now here we're talking about conducting procurements. Your purchase order may have some impact on your plans because of however it finally washes out what you're going to buy. So PM plan updates could be baselines, your triple constraint. Communications plan may now be changed because now you have another player in the mix, another stakeholder, right? So you need to update your communication plan so you have consistency with how you communicate with them. Procurement management plans, again, may adjust because your procurement management plans are contained by activity 12.1. They have your procurement statement of work in it for that purchase amongst all your other purchases. So your plan may need to be updated with that. Project document updates. Again, requirements, your matrix which goes with it may have to be adjusted. Your risk register certainly might have to be adjusted, and your stakeholder register maybe too. So what we've done here now in conduct procurements is we've selected sellers. We've got our statement of work already from process one. We sent it out, got the bids in. We told them what we're going to be evaluating against. We look at the bids, tally them up, do all your analysis, negotiate everything you do. After you have your bidder conferences, select your seller, place your order, and you're ready to rock and roll and go into our next process, which is then controlling those procurements and finally closing them. And we'll look at that in our last and final module in PMBOK 5th edition.